is, the original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Griffith has moved, as an amendment, that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. If it suits the House, I will state the question in the form that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. When you think of Australia's most iconic natural places, overwhelmingly they've been protected under Commonwealth laws. The Kakadu National Park, the Daintree, the Franklin, the Great Barrier Reef, all of those iconic places that are so important to our natural environment, but also, of course, have become economic assets as well in terms of the tourism sector, creating jobs, have all been protected by the Commonwealth, usually in opposition to respective state governments of different political persuasions. It is indeed a powerful reminder that government can make good and lasting change if they have a long-term vision for the nation and not just a focus on themselves in the here and now. And I know that the great Bob Hawke, in the later discussions I had with him, would always go through his environmental record that he was so proud of in the Hawke Labor government. It is a powerful reminder that what those opposite propose is actually contrary to the national interest, contrary to protection of our natural environment, contrary to the creation of jobs, contrary to economic growth. We need environmental laws in this nation which protect our natural surroundings and attract investment. And what that means is that we need to have clear rules of engagement for business, and we do need fast, simple processes. It's very clear that if you have a proposal for an investment, then what you need to do is to have proper environmental assessments that are rigorous, but ones that don't create unnecessary delay, because time is money when it comes to investment. But you need to make sure that there's confidence from the public in those processes. And what's being proposed by this government will undermine confidence in the system. What's being proposed are Ambt-era laws which were rejected in 2014 and should be rejected in 2020. The Minister claims that her amendments are supported by the directions, to quote the Minister, supported by the directions outlined in the interim report carried out by Professor Graham Samuel this year. And it's certainly true that Mr Samuel has described the EPBC Act as ineffective, and that I think certainly you have no argument from this side of the House that we could look at improvements to the Act. But this isn't about improving the Act. This isn't about progress. This is about looking backwards. And it's very disrespectful as well, I believe, of a very fine Australian in Graham Samuel, someone who's distinguished, someone who I've worked with in a range of ways over many years, that he's produced this report and it's been trashed and not really looked at. Because it's not true that Mr Samuel thought the solution was for the federal government to walk away from its responsibilities to approve or refuse development applications which may have significant environmental impacts. Indeed, Professor Samuel recommended that the government introduce granular and measurable national environmental standards which would be the foundation of new environmental laws. He recommended that there be the development and accreditation process for states and territories to be able to grant environmental approvals, in some cases and in accordance with the national environmental standards. He recommended the establishment of an independent cop on the beat to develop national environmental standards and ensure the rules aren't being broken. He didn't say the Commonwealth should simply pass the buck and hand over environmental approvals to states without any rules and without any scrutiny. In fact, he warned against this very approach that the government is taking. He said there was significant concern about the ability of states and territories to uphold the national interest in making these decisions when the Ambt government tried this in 2014. When Samuel's interim report was released, the minister promised national environmental standards would be legislated at the same time as greater powers were given to the states. Standards that Graham Samuel describes as the foundation of the reforms that he's proposed. But the government has legislation but hasn't even bothered to draft any national standards. All they've done is try and hand over responsibility to environmental approvals to the states and territories. It's a bit like their national cabinet that isn't national and isn't a cabinet. Yeah. They want to take responsibility for anything good that happens, but anything else is someone else's fault. They just hand over their responsibility to the states and territories and then complain after the event. Well, what we need is national environmental standards that don't allow for complaint after mistakes have been made, that fix it in advance. Right. Because if you're complaining, by definition, it's too late. And we saw that, of course, tragically recently in Western Australia, where Indigenous heritage has been destroyed in such a graphic way. Once it's done, it's done. Once there's drilling on the Great Barrier Reef, it would have been done. Once the Franklin stopped flowing, it couldn't be restarted. Once the Daintree was destroyed, you couldn't remake it. You can't fix what our natural environment takes tens of thousands and sometimes millions of years to produce. And that's why we need to get it right. That's why the responsibility on these issues is so important, because it goes beyond our time in this place. It goes beyond our time on this earth. What we do in this place makes a difference for a long period of time. Now, when the key to the Samuel Review interim report was a recommendation for an independent regulator to develop these standards and to ensure compliance. A regulator should not be subject to actual or implied direction from the Commonwealth Minister. Well, that's not a problem, because the regulator isn't subject to any direction, given it doesn't exist under this legislation. So states can approve development applications, but there are no rules on what can or can't be approved, no scope for enforcing those rules if they are ever developed, and no compliance monitoring. Samuel also highlighted the failure of the EPBC Act to recognise and value Indigenous knowledge and views, and recommended the National Environmental Standards included a specific standard on best practice Indigenous engagement. The legislation ignores that too. Under the government's amendments, development approvals will be made by states and territories instead of the federal government over matters of national significance. Well, we should be clear about what that means. There are 8 matters of national environmental significance currently protected by the EPBC Act, and Samuel recommended strengthening protections for them. They are World Heritage properties like Kakadu, National Heritage places like Fraser Island, wetlands of international importance like the Coorong and its lower lakes, migratory species protected under international agreements like the humpback whale, Listed threatened species like the Leadbetter's possum, Commonwealth marine areas like those around Lord Howe Island, the magnificent Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and nuclear actions including uranium mines. Now, we have international agreements on these 8 areas. We effectively agree that any development will be consistent with principles to protect the environment covered under these categories. Now, that's an important responsibility to the international community, but we have a greater one, and that's to future generations. That's to our kids and our grandkids to come, for some of us, we hope, not too soon. We believe that when we look at those issues, we do understand how significant it is. Now, let's have a look at, in conclusion, what the problems have been with the EPBC Act and some of its functions, because these amendments won't fix any of them. They won't create more jobs, they won't approve appropriate developments more quickly, or give inappropriate ones a quick refusal so they can move on. They won't create the certainty that's needed to drive greater investment. This government knows that that's the case. Under this government, approval delays for development projects have blown out by more than 500%, and in 79% of environmental decisions they've made an error. 95% of decisions are actually late, and it's no coincidence that they've cut the Environment Department by 40%. So they've made cuts to the department. The assessments aren't taking place in a timely manner, a blowout of more than 500%, and their solution isn't to fix what's gone wrong on their watch. The solution of the government is just to hand it over to someone else, to states and territories. Now, companies wanting to get approval for developments will have to navigate under this proposal as well 16 different sets of rules across the country. It will make the processes more complex when what we should need is more simplicity. It will add to delays, not reduce them, add to complexity, not simplify them, and a bad outcome for all those seeking to do business, but a bad outcome for the environment. Now, I was the Shadow Environment Minister, proudly, some time ago in this place. At that time, I spoke about Australia facing an extinction crisis. That crisis has got worse, not better. Climate change is meaning that it is having a dramatic effect on our flora and our fauna. I said then that we were going backwards. Habitat was being lost, species were disappearing. But what we're seeing is a crisis, an extinction crisis in this nation. It's something that should be of great concern to us. And I know Australians are concerned about these issues. You only have to look at what occurred with koalas and the impact that the bushfires had. But something else happened there too, Mr Deputy Speaker, which is internationally there were more funds raised to protect koalas in Australia than there were to protect people. Now, that's not to say that internationally they weren't concerned about the impact that it had on Australians. But what it did signify is how much of our great nation is identified with our natural assets, be they physical, in the form of these places that we need to protect, or be they natural, our flora and fauna, our koalas, our kangaroos, our flora as well. That makes this place special on Earth. We have an extraordinary natural environment that we need to cherish, we need to value and we need to protect. This legislation is bad legislation. Labor will be opposing it, and we're right to do so. The government should go back, actually have a look at what Graham Samuel has said, and come back to the drawing board if they're at all serious.
Yeah.